So it's 12 o'clock now, and I'm always one for starting on time. I'm Matt Clark. I'm the assistant professor in grape breeding and enology project at the U. And it's my pleasure today to introduce Annie Klodd. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Annie's work. She joined the university 2 years ago, just about, and has been really focusing on supporting grape growing and viticulture throughout the state. Annie brings with her a great skill set, having grown up on a farm growing grapes in southern Iowa, and brings her skill set from her graduate work studying grapes and grape production. So today's topic is on, as Annie has entitled, Revisit and Improve Your Vineyard Spray Program. This topic is something that has come to mind as we have met with growers across the state and the region who are always interested in improving their best practices for controlling pests and diseases in their vineyard. For me, one of the critical things is documenting and recording what activities you're doing and being thoughtful about your practices as your spray program not only affects your fruit quality and plant health, but also it may have some impacts for how and where you sell your fruit at the end of each season. All right, so I'm going to turn over to Annie. She's going to lead our discussion today. I will follow along in the chat box and interrupt as I can or see fit. And hopefully in about 45 minutes, we'll come back and we can have more conversation as needed about the topic for today. Thanks, Annie. Here you go.
Thanks, Matt. All right, so we're going to be talking about a few different things today. Basically, the goal of today is I want everybody to be able to think about their current spray program, or if you're a new vineyard, think about the spray program that you're going to be developing and try to make it so that it's really targeting the pests in our vineyard and making sure that the products you're putting on are effective and that we're putting them on at the right time of the year. So those are kind of the goals for today. I'm not going to be, we only have 45 minutes, so I'm not going to be talking about a lot of specific details about specific chemicals or specific pests. This is more about the process for developing a really good spray program. So I'll keep it pretty engaging, hopefully, and jump in whenever you want with questions. So we're making sure we're hitting on the topics that you guys are interested in as well. So I'm going to start by revisiting approaches to spraying. How people go about spray programs. And then we'll talk about 3 factors that are really important in developing a spray program, and that'll sort of lead our discussion into how to create or improve upon a vineyard spray program, specifically deciding what to spray and when. Those are 2 really important things. And then there are a lot of online resources that can be used to help you create a spray program. So I'll be cutting away from the PowerPoint presentation a few different times so that we can look at those resources and go through how to actually use those. Throughout this presentation, I'll be referring to pests. When I say pests, I'm not just talking about insects, I'm talking about both diseases and insects. When I say pesticides, I'm referring to fungicides, insecticides, or herbicides. But since we're going to be having an herbicide talk next week, we're not going to be going into detail about weeds or herbicides today. We'll be mainly focusing on diseases and insects. Another thing that we won't be focusing on today, but is still important to keep in mind, is canopy management and all those cultural things we do to reduce disease in the vineyard. Canopy management, clearing out dead debris at the end of the season, making sure your canopy has good airflow. Those are so important for disease management especially, but we cover those a lot in other workshops and online resources. So today, we're mainly focusing on the spray aspect of pest control. So why are we talking about this? Why is it so important? Well, growing grapes in the Midwest or other temperate areas, we see a lot of diseases, we see a lot of insects. There's just so much moisture in our environment and so much plant matter that this is a really good habitat for these pests. And so what we want to do is get to a point where we're not seeing too much of this, and instead we're seeing a lot more of this. Winemakers are looking for good yields. We're looking for good yields too in our vineyards, and they're looking for high quality fruit. We don't want to get into situations where we have rotten grapes, grapes with a lot of insect damage going into wine. So a good spray program is really important in helping us get to a situation where we've got a lot of high quality cold climate grapes. That's the goal. I want to pose a question to the group, and you don't have to respond in the chat box or anything like that. It's more just something to ask yourself. The first question is, how do you choose when to spray on your vineyard? Do you spray when you're seeing disease or insect damage? Are you spraying depending on the weather, the biology of the pests that are present, and the pests that you see? Or are you spraying at certain products at certain time intervals, like a calendar spray? And what I'm going to be focusing is the strategy in number 2. It's a really good idea to not just think about what insects and diseases you see, but also think about the biology and how they work, because that's going to determine when we're going to spray and what we're going to spray. And calendar sprays leave a lot to be desired, and I'm going to talk about why calendar sprays fall short. The second question, how do you choose what to spray? Do you choose what you have on hand? Do you choose what's the lowest cost or what you found a good deal on? Do you ask other growers or other viticulturists like me, like an extension agent, what they would recommend for spraying? Or do you refer to pesticide guides like university guides and experienced growers and viticulturists when you choose products? And do you choose products that are effective on the pests in your vineyard? If you've ever taken a multiple choice test of any kind, you probably can guess that my answer is number 4. We're not only choosing what's the lowest cost or what's convenient, although those can be factors, but it's really important to choose what's going to be most effective and through proven trials and research on the pests that we have in our field. There are probably a lot of factors to consider when developing a spray program, but there are 3 major factors that I'm going to be focusing on for the next few slides. So when developing your spray program, first, it's really important to think about what pests are present in the vineyard. Not just what pests do you currently see, but what pests are common in your area and what pests have you seen in previous years. Secondly, how does this pest work? What's its biology like? It's really important to know when it's active during the season and when it's infecting the vines in order to figure out when and what to spray. And third, how has the weather been and what's in the forecast? Are we going to be getting rain? Are we going to be getting a lot of wind? Things that can affect disease and insect populations. So I'll dig into number 1 first. So determining what pests are present or likely to be present, super important. One major thing that you can do as a vineyard manager is make sure you're walking through that vineyard weekly or more during the season. Look at what diseases are out there, especially if you've been changing up your spray program. Being able to walk out there and see how effective it's been is really vital. And then when you're looking at problems you see on the leaves, on the fruit, on the stems, make sure you're identifying those correctly, and I will get into some resources to help you do that. Secondly, don't just consider the pests that you currently see when you're walking out in the vineyard, but think about what diseases and insects you've seen in previous years and which ones are typically common in your area. So with diseases, this is particularly important, not to just focus on what you see, but to think about what you've seen in your vineyard in the past and what might be there based on what's common in the region. Because a lot of diseases are actually active. The spores are germinating and spreading through the plants before we can actually see the symptoms. So it's super important to a spray program that we're spraying them during those times when they're active and spreading versus just waiting until we see the symptoms, because by that point, it's going to be much harder to actually control those. I'm going to get more into detail on that in a few slides though. So there are numerous tools out there for identifying diseases and insects. The first one, if you are out in your vineyard and you see something, you don't know what it is, there is an online diagnostic tool through University of Minnesota Extension. Not a lot of people know about it, but it's called What's Wrong with My Plant. The link is here. So you can either, when I'm showing these slides, if you want to, you can take a screenshot, or you can just wait until I record the presentation and put it online. But this is a great resource. The Growing Grapes in Minnesota guidebook is one that I would recommend that everybody get who's growing grapes in a cold climate. This is a long, I think maybe 200, 250 page book that's updated every few years with new recommendations. It's a great thing to have. It's available online for free. And that's put out by MGGA. Ohio State University has a number of different disease fact sheets through their extension service. So they have, it's this database of resources online that they call Ohio Line. then you can go on there and find detailed information, but yet very easy to read information about different diseases and insect pests of vineyards. And so this is one example, for instance. I can just. So this is one example. This is a really great fact sheet on botrytis, otherwise called gray mold. And so you can see a photo of it, and then you can also read a lot about the biology of this disease and how to control it. You can also send samples to the University of Minnesota Plant Disease Clinic. And if you're in another state, you can still send it to our clinic, but a lot of state universities have their own disease clinic as well. They'll actually use microscopes and DNA analysis to identify what disease you have. Or if it's not a disease, they'll be able to tell you that too. If you're in Minnesota or Iowa, I also don't mind at all if you email or text me with photos of things that you're seeing out in the vineyard. And sometimes I will be able to say, oh yeah, that's black rot or that's phylloxera. But sometimes it's not possible just to see with the naked eye, and then you would need to send it to your disease clinic, and I can indicate that as well. A lot of other states do have extension educators like me, like Wisconsin, South Dakota, North Dakota. Of course, we have somebody from New York, Maine on this webinar today, Michigan. Those states all have an extension educator who you can send those photos to as well. All right, so number two, not just being able to identify the pests, but then going one step further. I like to say in order to better control our enemies, we need to know them really well and figure out how to best target them. So if you're a new grower or just looking to brush up on your disease and insect biology, read up on the common cold climate grape diseases and insects, but especially diseases, since those are such a tough issue for our vineyards. So you want to know when each disease infects the plants versus when it actually causes symptoms. So I'm going to go into this in more detail on the next slide, but here's one example. So this chart to the right, this is the botrytis bunch rot life cycle. And what this is showing is that the spores of this disease overwinter in the dead fruit that might be sitting either on the vines or on the ground. Those stay over in the winter, and then in the spring, they start growing on that debris. And then those spores are actually transported onto the shoots and the leaves of new plants in the late spring. So this is really interesting, right? Because botrytis, that's a bunch rot that we see during the harvest season, but it's actually infecting the vines months earlier than that. It's affecting the vines in the late spring. So those fungal spores actually hang out on that fruit all season if they're not sprayed for. And then when the fruit's starting to ripen, that's when it starts really showing up on that fruit. And that's when we think, oh my gosh, what's happening to these grapes? I won't be able to harvest them. And we want to go out and spray. That's only so effective. You really need to be spraying for that earlier in the season. So this is just one example of why it's so important to understand a little bit about the biology of all these pests. Secondly, what symptoms do they cause? For instance, powdery mildew is going to be a white, kind of fuzzy fungus on the top of the leaf, whereas downy mildew is going to be yellow. So know what symptoms these cause so you can differentiate the diseases. How do they spread? Do they spread by raindrops, wind? This is important because it has implications for our weather. If it's going to be rainy out, we know that maybe there's a higher incidence of disease that we should look out for. And what weather conditions do they like, which is related. All right, so I talked about this with bunch rot, how it needs to be sprayed for early in the season, even though we don't see the symptoms until much later. It's not just the case with bunch rot, it's actually the case with all of our most common diseases that we see up in the upper Midwest and on cold climate grapes. So this goes for black rot. It starts spreading to the vines in the spring and then starts showing up as dark spots or lesions on the leaves. That picture you can see down below starts showing up when the leaves start to die because of the fungus. And so we won't necessarily see the symptoms, but we need to be spraying for them ahead of time. So if you have black rot on your vineyard this year, you're probably going to have it next year too. So you can already plan ahead to be spraying early in the season and get ahead on that. Phomopsis, anthracnose, botrytis, like I mentioned before, and then powdery and downy mildew. These are a lot of our big diseases that we're trying to manage, and this kind of applies for all of them. They need to be sprayed early in the season to stop those infections that are starting. A tip with black rot, which is kind of nice, the fruit on cold climate varieties actually becomes resistant to black rot after about 4 to 6 weeks after bloom. So that means that we don't really need to be spraying for black rot after about, let's say, the conservative 6 weeks after bloom. You can focus on other diseases. It also means that if you see clusters that have berries starting to shrivel after about 6 weeks after bloom, that berry shriveling is probably due to something else and not black rot. So you need to be thinking about what else it could be due to and then control that instead of mistaking it for black rot and trying to spray for that. Insects. So there are several big insects that we focus on in Minnesota. If you look at online guides from, let's say, Ohio or New York and you live in the Midwest, you're going to see some insects on there that we don't struggle with too much, that we don't have to focus on. So knowing which insects are common in your area is important. So for instance, in Minnesota, we have a lot of Japanese beetles in most of the state. In Iowa, it's very common as well, and Wisconsin. Fruit flies, after veraison, you might have heard about spotted wing Drosophila. We've been talking quite a lot about this pest. That's an invasive fruit fly that infects fruit that is starting to split or that has been damaged in some way. But it's not the only fruit fly that we worry about. Lots of fruit flies can spread diseases like sour rot. So we need to be spraying for those if we start seeing them. Phylloxera, which are those galls, spray when it first appears. That's the best thing you can do rather than waiting until you see a lot of it, because if you spray it when you first see it in the beginning of the season, that's going to start cutting off its life cycles for later in the season. Flea beetles, this is something we spray for some years, but not all. Some years it's really bad. Like I had a lot of vineyards in 2018 that were reporting flea beetles, but really not so much this year when I followed up with those vineyards. So you need to be going out in the vineyard and seeing if you observe flea beetles before we start spraying for them. Multicolored Asian lady beetles is one. Again, just one in a batch of grapes can really impact the fruit quality and the wine quality. So it's important to look out for multicolored Asian lady beetles. They're the ones that look like ladybugs. That happens late in the season during soybean harvest. There are a lot of resources, again, for learning more about pests beyond just the identification phase. So there's a guide that University of Minnesota faculty put out a few years ago. It's called the Grape IPM Guide for Minnesota Producers. This goes into a lot of awesome detail about each of these insect and disease pests, and it was written for grape growers specifically. So you can check that one out, see if I can navigate to it right now. So this is the link that you go to find this guide. It's just, you can go here and download the PDF, save it on your computer, then you've got it for later. Great resource. Again, the Ohio State fact sheets are great. The Growing Grapes in Minnesota guidebook that I mentioned before. And then there's a lot of other university research-based articles about vineyard pests. So how do you find all those? The tip that I like to use is when you're in a Google search, let's say you're searching for black rot in grapes. Instead of just searching grape black rot into Google, because you're gonna find all kinds of blogs and gardening resources that way, type blackrotgrape.edu or grapebotrytis.edu. Because if you type .edu, it's gonna filter those university resources to the top. Not saying that university resources are the only source of good information for vineyards, but it's going to make sure that you've got trustworthy resources at the top of your search rather than those being filtered to the bottom.
Annie, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry to interrupt. There was a question from a couple of slides ago that asked, when you say spray early season, is that April or May? And I think they're referring to control for fungi. I'm guessing you're going to talk more about the season as we go along, but I don't know if you wanted to comment before you got too far.
Yeah, I will get into that a little bit more, but thanks for bringing that up to clarify. Yep, when I'm talking about early season, I'm talking about bud swell, bud break, and bloom, that kind of time frame. So that's, for us in Minnesota, that's typically mid to late May when that's happening. There are a couple of sprays that we sometimes do before bud break, during bud swell. One of those is lime sulfur. That's the big one. And that's to kill fungal spores like anthracnose that are hanging out on old material from last year. But yeah, when I say early season, I'm talking about those early grape development stages like bloom and bud break and bud swell. Was there another question, Matt? I saw a few.
There was just a comment when you were talking about resources for selecting chemicals. Jameson commented that talking to your chemical dealer is also can be a good resource because they know what's available in the marketplace.
Mm-hmm. All right, so number 3, consider the weather. This is important as well, and this is where calendar sprays fall short because they don't really allow you to consider the weather. So rainfall and temperature really impact our disease infection, and so when you're developing a spray program, make sure your spray program is flexible enough to allow rainfall and temperature to impact when you're timing your sprays. Don't say, well, I'm spraying on Thursday because that's what my calendar says, regardless of the weather. Really factor in the rain. Damp, humid conditions do stimulate disease. This applies to pretty much all of our vineyard diseases that we deal with. So, for instance, powdery mildew, it really loves wet leaves and temperatures that are between about 68 to 77 degrees. It can definitely infect outside of those temperatures, but if you have, let's say, a rainy period where it's kind of misting all day and it's cool, 65, 69 degrees, those are really good conditions for getting powdery mildew. For black rot, it's pretty similar, except black rot's optimal range is a little bit wider. And so those diseases can infect the leaves within just a few hours of when it starts raining. It's important also to point out that 2 inches of rain does wash off a fungicide application. So if you see a really heavy rain coming up, within a day or two, think about maybe waiting after that to apply fungicide so that it's not just washing off as soon as it's applied. I mentioned black rot before and how it likes cool temperatures and kind of wet leaves. So this is data from a model that was developed a few years ago. And what it's showing is in the left-hand column, that's temperature in degrees Celsius. But the middle column is temperature in Fahrenheit, which I like to use. And then on the right is hours of leaf wetness. And so this is the number of hours during or after a rain that the leaves are remaining wet. So let's look at the middle. It says between about 60 and 85 degrees. Look at that. And then if you look over to the right-hand column, you can see that it only takes 9 or fewer hours for black rot to infect leaves between about 60 and 85 degrees. So you can see a rainy period, it really doesn't take very long for it to infect. Downy mildew and water have a great relationship as well. So spores overwinter on leaf debris, as they do with many of our diseases. And then those spores are going to germinate on that leaf debris at about 52 degrees. So this is happening mid-spring whenever we get kind of a cool day, once the snow's actually melted. And they're going to be spreading up to the leaves once the leaves start growing with rain. So those raindrops kind of splash up, and it's amazing how far those raindrops can spread, especially if it's misty or foggy. And then those can infect those wet leaves within 2 hours if the temperatures are about 77 degrees. If it's a little cooler outside, 43 degrees, they can still infect those leaves within about 9 hours. So it doesn't take a whole lot. So we need to think about, has it been rainy lately? Has it been wet? And try to get out there to the vineyard to spray, because those diseases are actively infecting the leaves. Okay, so I've mentioned calendar sprays a couple of times here, and I want to talk about why just a simple calendar spray falls short. I know it's very simple to think, I'm going to spray every 10 days, or I'm going to spray every 2 weeks, and this is what I'm going to spray. It's an easy way to talk to maybe your employee, somebody who's coming out to spray for you, but it's really not ideal, and it leaves a lot to be desired. So some of the shortfalls of calendar sprays: first, they don't consider weather. If you're dead set on spraying every 2 weeks, you're not able to think about spraying after a rain to target those diseases that are just developing. They don't consider what pests are present. If you're using a calendar spray that says, for instance, this one on the right, that you need to spray Captan every 2 weeks, that's not considering what diseases are actually there, because Captan is not equally effective on each disease. Third, they often ignore pesticide resistance, which is what I'm going to go into next. If you're spraying the same one or two chemicals several times a year, every year, that's creating a scenario where our pests can become resistant to those chemicals. So it's our responsibility as farmers, as grape growers, in every crop, to make sure we're diversifying our chemicals so that we're not accidentally propagating resistant populations of pests. So, you know, on this calendar to the right, I put a few red flags on things that I saw to be issues that I would want to fix in a spray program. The first one, you know, Roundup, we'll kind of go into that next week, but saying you're always going to spray Roundup at the beginning and the end of the year, not great. You need to watch out for what diseases you have in your vineyard. The second red flag I have there, if we're going left to right, Imidin. So Imidin is an insecticide, but it's not very effective on most of our insect pests. So it's unclear what they were actually using Imidin for in this pest program. Since they were going to apply it at bud swell, I'm guessing it was for flea beetles, but Imidin is not that effective on flea beetles. There are other products that are better on that. Wrangler, you know, it's not really clear what they were spraying Wrangler for. It's not really considering what pests are in the field at that point in time. Movento, you know, this is a pretty expensive product to be applying, and saying that you need to apply it at 2 different stages regardless of what pests are there is not a really good move. You need to look at what insects you have in the field before deciding if you really need to be applying that. And then applying Captan every 2 weeks, I mentioned that before, allow more flexibility than that, because Captan is not equally effective on everything. That's also a lot of applications of the same product without switching it up and trying to get some variety in there to target different pests. So pesticide resistance, I mentioned before. When we talk about pesticides, there are lots of pesticides of different types. In other words, we call this modes of action. That's the way that the pesticide attacks the plant. They're all attacking different physiological processes throughout the plant. Not just the plant, the insect, or the disease too. I was thinking about weeds in that case. But if we're applying the same thing over and over again, those insect or those disease populations, there's a good chance that they genetically, just a few of them happen to have genetic resistance to whatever we're spraying. And so if you keep spraying the same thing, there's a certain small amount of pests that aren't going to be susceptible to that spray. They're going to survive, and those ones are going to reproduce. And then if we keep spraying the same thing, it's still not effective on them, they're going to keep reproducing more and more. A few examples, since I used to work in weed management quite a bit, Palmer amaranth is an invasive weed. It developed herbicide resistance to a lot of different products because farmers were spraying, for instance, Roundup just too much, and it developed a ton of resistance to it. So that's, for instance, that's the type of scenario that we're trying to avoid when we alternate products between applications and not just use the same one over and over again. When you're looking in resources such as the Growing Grapes in Minnesota guide, when you're developing your spray program, try to factor this in. So this is a table out of the Growing Grapes in Minnesota guide, table 36, if you have that guide. And this is showing different modes of action and what codes they correspond with. So you can see things like inhibits signal transduction, mitosis, and cell division. These are just the different physiological processes that those pesticides act with when they're killing our pests. And so what you want to pay attention to here is the FRAC code on the left. These are numbers and or letters, and they designate different modes of action or different types of pesticides. So why this comes in handy is if you're looking at a pesticide table to figure out which pesticides are effective on which diseases or insects. Again, this one was taken out of the Growing Grapes in Minnesota guide. You can see that there is a column here with that mode of action or FRAC code. In this case, these are fungicides. So you can see, let's take Captan for instance. It's got an M next to it. If you spray Captan 10 times in the season, you're spraying the same mode of action over and over again. If you want to rotate Captan and Mancozeb, they're both M's. You're still using the same mode of action over and over, even though they're different products. So what's ideal is to find you know, 2 or 3 different products that have different frac codes or modes of action that are still effective on your pests. So that's one of our jobs when we're developing a spray program. So for instance, if I were to rotate between Rally and Balaton, for instance, that's not going to be rotating modes of action. But if I rotate between Rally and Captan, for instance, then I've got 2 different modes of action in my program. If you look at a table and it says RFP, this means fungicide resistance possible or probable. It just means fungicide resistance is possible with all of our products, but if it says RFP, it's especially probable. So you really need to watch out with those. All right, so this is just another example. If we're looking at botrytis control fungicides in the Growing Grapes in Minnesota guide, this is the effectiveness table again, same one I was looking at before. It says, do not apply more than 2 sequential sprays using one of these products or products with the same frac code. Frac, again, that's your mode of action. So it's saying if you're spraying for botrytis, you really need to be rotating between these different modes of action. If you've got a lot of botrytis coming up last year, let's say your vineyard struggled a lot with that, and you're going to be spraying for botrytis during bud break to bloom next season, you might want to buy Elevate and Scala. Don't just buy one product, because then you're not really able to rotate between those appropriately. Okay, were there any other questions before I get into this next part?
No, none have popped up.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so the point of that first section was to, you know, equip everybody with information for how to really construct a vineyard spray program. And then I'm going to get into the nitty-gritty of actually doing that. So when you're constructing your vineyard spray program, you want to make sure these criteria hold true. And this is kind of a review from what I was just discussing. First, early season fungicide applications are very important. Those need to be strong in your spray program. So spraying from about bud swell to when the grapes are at pea size, it's really critical. And then from there on, it's more about spraying as needed based on the pests that you happen to be seeing in the vineyard. 2, the schedule can be altered based on weather and what pests are present. 3, you're alternating pesticide modes of action, like I just talked about, rather than relying too much on 1 or 2. 4, the pesticides that you choose are highly effective on the pests present. I'm going to be getting into effectiveness tables that you can use for that to determine that. Application timing is based on the fruit stage and not on the calendar. So instead of saying I'm going to spray the first and second week of June, think instead about spraying based on what growth stage our plants are at, because as our climate is changing, we can't really predict very well when bud break is going to happen or when bloom is going to happen, for instance. So we can't just say, I'm going to start spraying on May 25th. If we haven't had bud break yet, that's not going to be as relevant as it would if you're going by growth stage. And a lot of the resources I'm going to show will tell you what to spray based on growth stage, which is really, really handy. Your program uses objective research-based recommendations. Try to avoid commercial bias. So while, yes, like Jameson was saying earlier, your chemical reps are very knowledgeable, just make sure that you're also double checking that information with research-based recommendations like the university guides that we have. Just make sure that you are spraying something that's both economical and effective on your pest. And then 7, try to avoid using broad spectrum insecticides if you can, such as 7, for instance. That 7 is really effective not only at killing our insect pests, but also killing our pollinators, like bees. And so if we can avoid spraying something like that and doing an alternative that's more specifically effective on the pest at hand, that's going to be a very good thing. All right, so when developing our spray program, you may already have something like this on file that you use to determine what and when to spray. But if you're somebody who's wanting to create a new spray program or just start yours from scratch, this is one template that you can use. You can either take a screenshot of this or just wait for the recording to come out. But what I've created here is a 5-column spray program template. In the left-hand column, I have growth stage, not calendar date. And so you can see bud swell, bud break, and then the next 3 are based on shoot growth up until bloom. And then after bloom, the growth stages are basically based on, or they're not based on growth stages so much, they're based on do we see diseases or insects, and we call those cover sprays. Those are roughly going to be 10 to 14 days apart. Again, watch the weather and let your weather impact when you're actually going to be doing those cover sprays. And then the next growth stage is veraison. There are certain products that we need to think about spraying then, and then during harvest, if needed. We don't always need to be spraying a bunch during harvest. It's mainly if we're seeing disease and insect problems that are going to be affecting our yield and quality. The next column, pest to control. So we're going to be showing some resources that you will use to determine this, but what pests are you trying to control during these different growth stages? And do you need to control those annually or just as you actually observe them in the field? What products can you spray to control these well? And then what are the application rates for those products? So to start out, what tools are we going to use for this? There are a number of different tools out there, but I'm going to go through a few that I really like using and kind of show how to use those. Before I do that, is there a question, Matt?
Yes, there is a question about Japanese beetle. Are there sprays effective for Japanese beetle that are less harmful for pollinators, or another strategy maybe would be timing of those sprays?
Mm-hmm. I will be showing an insecticide table pretty quick here, so I'll make sure to point those out and try to get that question answered.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, it should be when we go to this insecticide effectiveness table in a minute. So the Growing Grapes in Minnesota guide has a huge section on both insect and disease management, and within those sections they have tables that show a lot of different products and how effective those different products are on the common insects that we have. These are the pages they are on in the guide, and I'm just going to bring those up here. So everybody should be able to see my screen still. This is what the Growing Grapes in Minnesota guide looks like. This is just the PDF. It's great. It's about 168 pages long, it says. And within that guide, just pretend I scrolled down to page 126. This is the fungicide effectiveness table. It gives a lot of really great information, including the re-entry interval and any harvest restrictions that it has. So what we've got is, if you look up the top, running left to right, these are several of the most common diseases that we need to be thinking about with cold climate grapes. Bitter rot, we don't have as much of that, but it is something that can happen. And then if you look down this left column here, we've got different fungicide products, including organic approved fungicides. If there are any organic growers on this webinar today, those are included. So what this shows is a bunch of plus signs. And if I go down here to the bottom, it says that the plus signs indicate effectiveness. So if you see a product next to an insect that has 3 plus signs, that means it's highly effective. 2 plus signs, it's moderately effective. And I would avoid something where it says it's only slightly or not effective. All right, so for example, let's say I want to control downy mildew, and I want to find a product that's very good on downy mildew. I scroll down, I see that all of these protectant fungicides have either 3 or 2 plus signs. That means most of those are highly effective on downy mildew. Let's see, if I go over to powdery mildew and I scroll down a little bit, there are a number of products that are very effective on powdery mildew, but a lot of them say that RFP next to them. That means that fungicide resistance is more probable. So you just need to be aware of that. If you're going to be using one of these products for powdery mildew control, make sure that you're not just using that one and you're actually rotating between a couple of them. So for instance, you could use Topsin for powdery mildew control. That's your mode of action 1, but then also think about getting another product such as Savando, Torino, Quintec, that has a different mode of action that's also effective on it. And you can rotate those two products for powdery mildew. All right. And it, of course, stopped my progress. Let me go back to where I was. Okay, we're just going to stay here for a minute since I'm going to be cutting in and out. The insecticide effectiveness table is set up very similarly to this fungicide table. You can see up here, these are a lot of our very common insects that we find in cold climate grapes. This is also very helpful because this basically is a list for you to, over the winter, go research a lot of these insects and see how they work. There are a couple of exceptions here. We don't see as many leafhoppers in Minnesota. We don't see as many red-banded leaf rollers or climbing cutworms. So the ones that, you know, I think you should really focus on are great flea beetle, berry moth. Be aware of that one and know what to look for, but we don't see it as much. Be aware and understand great phylloxera, Japanese beetles, multicolored Asian lady beetles, and spider mites, not quite as important. So somebody was asking about Japanese beetle. What I would say with that one is try to avoid relying on 7 for Japanese beetle, this one right here, because 7 is a broad spectrum pesticide. And so if you're spraying that for Japanese beetle, you're also going to be greatly affecting your pollinators. But another tip for Japanese beetle is for protecting pollinators in general, if you can spray later in the evening or in the very early morning, pollinators are not as effective during that time, and so you're less likely to be affecting them. Unless anybody had another question on that, I will keep going.
I don't see any other questions.
Okay, so the Grape IPM Guide, again, is a really great resource while constructing your program. The Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide. This one is awesome and really great when you're constructing your program. So let's look at this one. And I think the grape program is about page 79. Yep. All right, so this program is awesome. What it shows here is basically a very in-depth spray program where they go through each different grape growth stage, and they tell you for which pests, like insects and diseases, you need to be controlling for during that growth stage, what products or materials are effective on that pest, and then what rate you should be applying them. There are also some really important comments like restrictions. So for instance, what we're looking at right now is delayed dormancy through bud swell. So these are really, really early season before bud break. And it's saying you need to worry about anthracnose to try to find something to control that. And then flea beetle as well. These other ones, again, this is why you need to do your research, figure out if they're common in our area. In Minnesota, at least, we don't need to worry quite as much about these 3 right here, but really focus on flea beetle and anthracnose. And so then it tells you what products are effective, which is awesome. But then you can also cross-check this information with the effectiveness tables that are in the Growing Grapes in Minnesota guide. So you can see, okay, the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide is saying that these 5 products here, Baythroid, Danitol, Imidan, Scorpion, and 7 can be sprayed for flea beetles. But let's double check and see which products are the most effective. All right, so then I go back to my insecticide table and I look for grape flea beetles. Scroll down, Danitol is very effective, Baythroid, moderately effective. But it doesn't show that Imidan has very good effectiveness. 7 is another one that's effective, but then again, watch out for your pollinators. So if you use both guides, you can cross-check and get a lot more intricate information that way. And then there's another spray program guide put out by the University of Maryland. I really like this one a lot. It kind of does the same thing as that Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide does, where it goes through each individual grape growth stage and tells you what pests you should be looking out for and what options you have to control them. So the link for that one is right there. Very, very good. Those are the tables I just showed. Was there another question?
There's just a general comment from Mark Hart from Wisconsin who says, He's surprised that rose chafer is not on the insect list, and it is problematic on sandy soils, which are prevalent in Minnesota. So
Yeah,
more
that
of a
one.
comment than a question.
Yeah, sure. That's a good comment, Mark. I appreciate it. Yeah, that one, I'm not sure why it's not on the insecticide table. Spotted wing Drosophila is also not on here. I think, that's because it was published in 2016 and we could use an update for that. There wasn't a lot of data out there at that point in time for spotted wings. So, but I don't know why rose chafer's not on there. Good point. All right. So I kind of already showed this one. This is just the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide again. And you can see in this case, it's showing grape 4 to 10 inch shoots. So it's really nice. There's a ton of information to use when you're developing your spray program. This is what the title of that Maryland guide is. So again, you can take a screenshot of this if you're trying to look for it later. Really great resource, a lot of information. All right, so I wanted us to kind of practice using these resources to create a spray program. So let's say you are going to use the template that I showed a couple of slides ago. All right, so let's start with bud swell. You're trying to figure out what pests you need to manage during bud swell and what you should be spraying on those. So first, I'm going to go to my Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide. I'm going to scroll to the part of that guide where it talks about bud swell. I'm going to look, all right, what are the pest problems that we could encounter? Well, anthracnose, let's say I've seen that on my vineyard. I know that it's bad and I need to spray for it. European red mite, grape mealybug, grape scale, maybe you've seen a little bit of that, but you're not going to focus on them too much. Flea beetle, yes, you've seen that before. You know you need to spray for it. Okay, so then let's say the next thing, we type these in here, flea beetles and anthracnose, and then the next question is, do I need to spray this every year, or do I just need to spray for this pest as needed? When it comes to flea beetles, we read about them and we realize we don't see them every year. So that's something that just needs to be sprayed as needed. All right, so then let's say, what products do we want to spray for flea beetles at bud swell? And so for that, I'm going to go back to my insecticide table. I'm going to look in this second column here for flea beetles. And what I'm looking for is products that are more effective on it. So Baythroid, some effectiveness. Now Danitol, this one is very effective on flea beetle. But if you look over here to the left next to Danitol, there's a little RUP. That means it's a restricted use pesticide. So you do have to be certified to apply pesticides in order to apply a restricted use pesticide. So we do have one of those trainings coming up for fruit and vegetable growers in January on the 15th, if you would like to get certified to apply RUPs. All right, so another product that we can spray on it is 7, and the chart indicates that as well, that it's very effective. And then I want to know my rate, and so to know the rate, you're going to go back to the pest management guide, and let's take flea beetle again, for example. Let's say I want to spray Danitol, and it tells me to spray between 5 and 10 fluid ounces of that product to control flea beetle. All right, so for time, I'll skip the rest of that, but you kind of get the process of how to use these different resources. There are a couple other example spray programs that you can use to formulate your own, kind of use them as a template. One of them is from Purdue. Let's see if I can find this one. This is a Purdue spray program for grapes. There's more vinifera grown in Indiana, so just take that with a grain of salt, cross-check it with our Growing Grapes in Minnesota guide to make sure that all of the recommendations you're using are also relevant to cold hardy hybrids. But this is a really nice, just really simple example that you can work from. And then University of Kentucky has one as well. That's this one. I think it's awesome because it allows you to actually fill it in yourself. This is another very simplified program from, I think this is Vermont. So when I show the recording, you can look at this more and kind of just read that. It's not meant to be used verbatim. It's just meant to serve as kind of a simplified example. All right, so the last thing I want to touch on here real quick is budgeting your pest management program. So Kevin Fowler from Old Crow Vineyard, and I will just go back to full screen here. Kevin generously shared his spreadsheet with me that he's been using to budget out his pest control program. Kevin was interested in knowing if the pest program he's using is effective and economical, and if there are ways he could decrease his pest control costs. And so he went through here, and it's really awesome. He listed all the products that he's using, fungicides, herbicides, and insecticides, said what the cost was, the cost per ounce, how many times he's using it through the year, and then he was able to calculate how much it's actually costing him relative to his total pest management cost. And so Kevin sent this to me, and I looked at it and I thought, wow, that's a lot that's being spent on Movento, because that's about 20% of the total cost per acre for his pest program. And so then we sort of talked about, what are you spraying Movento for? Is it necessary to be spraying that much? And in this case, it's for phylloxera, which he has in his vineyard, but he might be able to spray less of this by just targeting the areas of the vineyard that actually have phylloxera, and making sure that he's spraying that early in the season so that he doesn't have to do subsequent sprays later. And that's going to cut back on that Movento cost. So budgeting out this spray program of yours is going to be a great idea. See if you can cut anything, or if you can replace it with maybe something still effective but more economical. All right, so this is just a review of some criteria that I think everybody should think about when they're improving their spray program. Make sure your early season is strong. Insects and later season disease control is based on monitoring. Walk out in the vineyard, see what's going on. The schedule can be altered based on weather and the pests present. You're not just spraying based on a calendar. You can alternate pesticide modes of action to reduce resistance. The pesticides chosen are highly effective on the pests present. Application timing is based on bud or fruit growth stage, not on a calendar. The program uses objective research-based recommendation. Try to avoid commercial bias by checking multiple sources. And then avoid broad spectrum insecticides that kill beneficial insects if and when you can. And then a last reminder, remember that not every weird thing that we see in the vineyard is bad. These are a couple things I saw this season. It doesn't mean that your vineyard is doomed. It just looks kind of gross and weird. But also, not every bad thing is an insect or a disease. So keep that in mind too. There are nutrient disorders that we can see, and there are weird physiological disorders. There's also pesticide drift or herbicide drift, to be more specific, which is what we're seeing in this picture, the weird curled up leaf there. The thing on the right is bunch stem necrosis, which is a physiological issue. It's not a disease. So spraying for that isn't going to help at all. So it's really important to know exactly what we're dealing with before you go out and spray. All right, so that's all I've got. Ooh, looks like I saved a few minutes for questions.
Annie, I didn't see any more get typed in, but we can give an opportunity for people to do that now. Do you want to plug next week's while we wait?
Yeah, and I did see somebody ask, are these slides available? And the answer is, as I've said before, the recording will be posted on the enology at umn.edu website. I can't send out the raw PowerPoint slides. It's just a university policy, but I can probably post the PDF when I post the webinar recording. So I'll be doing another webinar next Tuesday, same time, Tuesday at noon, and we'll be focusing in on herbicide programs, and not just herbicides, but other weed management mechanisms as well, such as cover cropping, just mowing, mulching, other things that we can do to help control weeds. And we'll also be discussing the question of, why are weeds actually so important in vineyards, or are they even? So it should be an interesting discussion. Looking forward to that. This webinar is part of a grant that Matt and I have that's funded by SARE, or the North Central Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program. They have funded a program that Matt and I and others are working on to create an online course around growing cold climate grapes. So this webinar will also be part of that course.
We have a comment from Nick that says, thanks for the presentation, very informative.
Thank you.
So thanks, Nick.
And it's interesting to note we had people on this webinar from 7 states today. So I appreciate all the participation from outside of Minnesota. I don't know what growers in Iowa are doing without Mike White. I know I miss him being around. Is there another question?
No, just some commendations. Great job from Justin Dooley. I think
Oh, thanks.
Justin is a new winery proprietor in the West Metro of the Twin Cities.
Yep.
I haven't met yet, but that's I think what I'm remembering. So great, some new faces and some old ones and some great expertise from Annie today.
Thanks, Matt.
So we'll hopefully see you all next week.
All right. Thanks. Have a great rest of your day,
Oh, wait, hang
everyone.
on one second. There's another question box where people wrote something.
Um,
I
I
didn't
don't
see
see any
this one.
questions on it.
Oh,
You want me to
okay,
go through?
great.
All right. Thanks, everyone.